Welcome back. Thank you for letting me look at your faces while I'm sharing with you. I have to tell you something funny that happened. I don't funny. In 2016, 2017 or so, somebody approached me and asked me, he was starting a Facebook page about Mashiach and Geula, and it was just at the very beginning of me teaching non-Jews. Um, and I was still very much um, I was still very much teaching Jews exclusively. Anyway, so he asked me to make these recordings, and I made about 8 or 10 of them, very short, on different aspects, different teachings about Mashiach and Geula, nothing like the hour that we spend together. And and then I forgot about them, to be perfectly honest, until I ran across one and I said, oh, let me see if I can find them. Anyway, last night I did a little technical hocus pocus stuff and I recovered, I think, 10 of them and I posted them to YouTube. And all of a sudden I started getting views. Now, I don't think it was you guys. And I thought, like, who the heck even knows that, like, literally, I would post it. And while I'm posting another one, somebody or 12 people were looking at the one that I had just posted. So I think that there's people, they must have alerts or something set up on YouTube for keywords like Geula, Mashiach, something like that. Um, and so if you're interested, I'm happy in the group. I'll share with you the YouTube link to that playlist. I mean, the whole thing is it'll take you less than a half an hour to look at all of them if you're interested. Um, so I separated them and I put them in another category. I actually and it reminded me that I also made some very short videos for a while. I don't know who among you knows about this. Donna Jolehu isn't here tonight, but she knows about it. Natalie, me, you might. I did this thing a couple of times in Jerusalem called Torah School for the Nations. This is pre-COVID. And what we had was in-person classes for a whole day, taught by Jewish teachers for non-Jews who were visiting Israel. So we did it during the Passover holiday and during the Sukkot holiday when like groups of tourists and Christian Zionists and so forth would come, and they would spend a whole day studying with us. So for various reasons, I did it. I think I did it 3 times that I remember, the in-person learning, and it was really a lot of fun. And then I started making these videos in between because they were only once a year or something, where I would teach like something about Jewish literacy, or some small aspect of it, also very brief, not professional videos, just me with my phone. And I found a couple of those also. So I started saving some of those. So I don't know, maybe I'll get into I don't know what to do with this, that I'll get into making short videos again. There are people who do this kind of thing that are very polished, and I am definitely not polished. I don't know really anything about video editing and so forth, but that's all an aside. Let's go on to tonight's topic, which is Vayeshev, the Parsha of Vayeshev. Vayeshev is in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, chapter 37, verse 1. So this one starts at the very beginning of chapter 37, and it goes until chapter 40, verse 23. And like always, the name of the Parsha, Vayeshev, means and he dwelt, and it's found in that first verse, Genesis Bereshit 37:1. So I'm going to do a summary, but most of what we're going to talk about tonight is about as usual, is about one part of the story. But let's just do the overview. This parsha really begins what I think of as the Joseph stories, and they're going to continue. The Joseph stories are going to continue for a good number of weeks. So what happens is Jacob, now he settles in Hebron, which is like a half an hour, maybe 20 minutes south of where I am sitting right now, with his 12 sons. And his favorite is his 17-year-old son, Joseph, because he is the first son of his favorite wife, Rachel. And all of the brothers are jealous of Yosef because he gets preferential treatment from his father, like the coat of many colors that you're familiar with, that Yaakov made for Yosef, that Jacob made for Joseph. And also, Yosef relates to his brothers. He tells over two dreams that he had. This, I know you're real familiar with this part of the story. I'm just saying this is where you find it, that foretell this idea that he's going to somehow rule over them. And that does not endear him to them anymore. They already don't like him very much. And so two of the brothers, Shimon and Levi, Simeon, I think that's how you say it, they plot to kill him. But the oldest brother, Reuven, the first brother, says, I have a better idea. Let's throw him into a pit. And Reuven had the idea that he would come back later and rescue him. But while Yosef is in the pit, um, Yehuda, another brother, the fourth brother, I think, sells him to a band of passing Ishmaelites. So now the brothers have a real problem. What are they going to do? So they take this special coat of his and they dip it in the blood of a goat and in order to bring it to Yaakov, to their father, leaving the impression without actually misrepresenting the facts, leaving the impression that their son was his favorite son was devoured by a wild beast. Okay, that's the beginning of the Joseph narrative. Now we're going to talk about this other story that interrupts it in this parsha, and that's where so Yehuda gets married. Yehuda's the one who sold him to this band of Yishmaelim. And he gets married. He has three children, three sons. And the oldest, whose name is Er, he dies young and childless. And his wife, Tamar, is given in Levirate marriage to the second son, whose name is Onan. Now, I don't know if you know this concept of Levirate marriage. It does not exist anymore today, but it's a biblical concept that plays into this story. So I'm just going to take a minute to explain. It's some of it is very Kabbalistic and some of it is legalistic. But the idea is that if a man gets married and he dies before he has children, before he has an heir, then his brother, his next brother, is obligated to marry the widow, and the first son that they produce would be considered this father's heir. It might be the first child. I'm not 100% sure. Doesn't exist anymore, but it did in biblical days. And and so the oldest son dies without children. So his next son marries Tamar, and he also dies young. Now, Yehuda has one more son left, whose name is Shelah, and Shelah is too young yet to get married. And so there's a pause in the action. So there's these two marriages that happen. Um, and both of these sons have died. And Tamar knows why, but Yehuda has no idea why. And he does not want to lose. He's thinking she's like the Black Widow or something, and that anybody who marries her is going to die early. But Tamar knows that she is destined to have children from this family. And so she disguises herself as a prostitute. And who does she seduce? She seduces Yehuda himself. And then Yehuda hears that his daughter-in-law, who's supposed to be a widow and waiting for this third son to grow up, is pregnant, and he wants her to be executed for being a prostitute. But Tamar produces some personal effects that he left behind as a pledge when he was with her intimately, and he publicly admits that he is the father. And Tamar indeed gives birth to two sons, Peretz, who is an ancestor of King David, and Zerach. Okay, now the Parsha goes back to the Joseph story, where Joseph is taken to Egypt and he's sold to Potiphar. Who is Potiphar? Potiphar is the minister who's in charge of the slaughterhouses of Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's like the big guy. Potiphar's sort of next in line. God blesses everything that Joseph does, and he rises up and up and up through his ranks, and he becomes the overseer of Potiphar's house, basically. Potiphar's wife has a thing now for Joseph. Now, it isn't, I don't want to be crass about it. It's not a simply a she is sexually attracted to him, but she also has some idea that she's supposed to have that a descendant with Joseph. Now, if you remember from last week when we talked about Osnat, she did in fact through her daughter, through her adopted daughter, she did in fact have a descendant through Joseph, but at this stage, she thinks it's supposed to be her. She's supposed to give birth, which is interesting because she's childless all this time and she adopts Osnat. She can't have children. But anyway, there's a whole big thing about Joseph rejecting her advances. She tells her husband Potiphar that this Hebrew slave, even though he's very high up in the hierarchy, that he tried to force himself on her and Joseph gets thrown into prison, and that's where he gains the trust and the admiration of his jailers, who appoint him to a position of authority, even in prison. And he meets the chief butler and the chief baker of Paro, who are both they're in jail because they messed up something with their royal master Paro. And they both have these disturbing dreams. This is where more dream imagery is in this parsha, and they tell their dreams to Joseph, which he interprets for them. And he tells one of them, the butler, that he's going to be released in 3 days and that the baker is going to die. He's going to be hanged. Okay. And Joseph asks the butler that when he goes back to his position, that to please intercede on his behalf with Paro. And in fact, Joseph's predictions about what happens to the butler and the baker are fulfilled, but the butler forgets all about Joseph and he doesn't do anything for him. Okay, that's the overview of the story. The part we're going to concentrate on is this middle part. So I'm going to do it two more times with you in greater depth. Okay. So I already told you that you already know that Tamar's story is told in the middle of this account of the sale of Joseph and his rise to becoming the viceroy in Egypt, right? And the one of the reasons why it's there is because Yehuda's behavior, so he basically solicited and was intimate with a prostitute, or who he thought was a prostitute, um, is in contrast to Joseph's resistance to sexual temptation in the home of Potiphar and the wife of Potiphar. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why these two stories appear together like that. But let's go back into Tamar. So Tamar marries Yehuda's oldest son, whose name is Er. Now, why did Er die young? According to our understanding, he did not want his wife to become pregnant and lose her beauty. And so he practiced, according to one opinion, he practiced anal sex with her. And and the sin was, it's a two-part sin. Number one, he viewed her as a sex object. In other words, he wanted her to remain beautiful and attractive to him more than he wanted children. And also he denied her sexual pleasure. So in Judaism, in Torah thinking, sexual pleasure, women's sexual pleasure is it's taken very seriously. And he denied that. And so he was considered evil by God, and God took him out of the story. Off you go. You blew it. And so now, because her husband died childless, she has this status of being a widow obligated to marry her deceased husband's brother. And that brother was Onan. Onan was the second son of Yehuda, as I mentioned before. He didn't want to father a son who would not be considered his. He would be considered his older brother, his dead brother's son. So he did marry Tamar, but he spilled his seed outside of her every time they were intimate in order to prevent her from conceiving. Now, it's interesting if you look up, I don't know if you know this word, there's a word called onanism, which is what it means is male masturbation. Okay. And so it comes from this biblical source. Onan had um, it had this way of being with her sexually where they were together, but he never ejaculated inside of her. She never conceived. Okay. That is now we have this third brother, Shelah, and he's very young. So Tamar has to wait for him to grow up before Shelah can marry him. And Yehuda has no intention of letting his third son marry her. As I said before. So she returns to her parents' home to wait for Shelah to grow up, to be old enough to get married. Um, but because of the way the law was then, because her two previous husbands died without producing children, by law, she wasn't allowed to marry anyone outside of her first husband's family. So she's stuck in a difficult situation. So she goes back to live with mommy and daddy or whoever, when it was ever in the family. And she sees that as time passes, Shayla is now old enough, but she's not being invited back to marry him. And so remember that she understands through some kind of low-level prophecy that she is supposed to have a child within this family. So she devises this plan to get pregnant by her father-in-law, Yehuda, accomplishing this task of number one, creating an heir for her first husband, and also of fulfilling what she understands as his prophecy. Now, these ideas are very complex in Jewish law and in Kabbalah. And I told you these marriages don't take place anymore. If you have a situation like this, what happens is that there's a ceremony that releases both the widow and the brother from the necessity to marry and create an heir for the deceased. That's how it is today. So um, but in effect, Tamar successfully accomplished this Levirate marriage with Yehuda. She dresses up as a prostitute. She sits at the crossroads that she knows he's going to pass by, because she heard that there was a sheep shearing festival that he was going to. This apparently was a big deal. We see it also in the story of David and Abigail, whatever you call her, that Naval, Abigail's first husband, was off sheep shearing. It was like a big deal. Anyway, the timing of this is that Yehuda's wife had passed away, and he was finished the mourning period for her, going to this sheep shearing festival. And that's when he comes upon Tamar in the crossroads. And when he spots her, he approaches her. But he wasn't planning this, so he didn't have any money with him, or he wasn't going to pay her with money. He was going to pay her with livestock. So she took some of his personal effects. Um, and she said, I'm going to hold on to these until you bring me a goat or two goats to pay for my services. Now, he does try to pay her. He sends a servant or somebody out, but of course she disappears because she's not really a prostitute. She was there just to find him. So the servant is never going to be able to find her. Meanwhile, she goes home and she dresses again in her widow clothes. And then Yehuda discovers that she's pregnant. She's assuming that she had been adulterous because she was sort of engaged to Shelah, the third son. So he orders her to be executed. And she produces these three items and she says, I am pregnant by the man who owns these articles. So she not only averts her own death, but the beautiful thing about this scene is that Yehuda admits that Tamar, is more righteous than I am. So Tamar, in fact, I told you this, she gives birth to twins, Peretz and Zerach, and Peretz is the ancestor of the house of David, and through the house of David, the Messiah, the son of David. Okay, so Peretz was the great grandfather of Boaz, who was the great grandfather of King David in the book of Ruth, okay, which leads to Mashiach ben David. So we'll talk about that towards the end. Why is that relevant? But anyway, that's the story. Now, I'm going to go even deeper with you in um, in sharing this. I'm sharing with you um, the approach of my own teacher, whose name is Rebbetzin Devora Fastag, and she um, prepared this lesson that I'm going to adapt and say over to you based on her deeper understanding of what's really going on here. Okay, so for one of the things to keep in mind, and this is true not just for this story, but whenever you learn anything about Torah, is that biblical commentary is meant to explain a spiritual principle, and it's not always meant to be taken literally. Okay, so there are a lot of people who understandably take the Bible very literally. Now, when you have rabbinic commentary, sometimes it can be hard to accept, or two uh, bits of midrash conflict with one another. They can't both possibly be actually true. So she's reminding us that there's some, it's like a vessel, a vehicle for teaching something, as opposed to a straight telling of a story. Okay, so just keep that in your mind. Okay, so she wants us to know that understanding the story of Yehuda and Tamar is not easy, that there's a whole bunch of unanswered questions. So one of them is, why does Tamar dress up as a harlot and wait for Yehuda at the crossroads where she knows he's going to pass by? It's true that he had said that she could marry his third son, Shelah, when he came of age, and she saw that this wasn't happening. But when Tamar saw that Yehuda wasn't keeping his word, she had the option to ask for this ceremony, this chalitza ceremony that would have freed her to marry somebody else. So why was it extremely necessary for Tamar to have a child from this family to the point where she would go to such extremes? That's one question. Now, Yehuda's behavior is even harder to understand, because our rabbis say that Yehuda, he's one of the 12 tribes. He was a great and righteous man, the son of Yaakov, and from him, as I just explained to you, the kingship of David and Mashiach is going to descend, and yet he acts in a way that seems very lowly. Not only does he consort with a woman that he thinks is a prostitute, but after, when it becomes known to him that Tamar is pregnant out of wedlock, he wants her killed. And even if we say that that's because Tamar was considered betrothed, engaged, whatever, to his son Shelah, it's still not it's not a honorable thing to do, especially because you can't impose punishment on someone else in an area where you yourself have tripped up. So even if your sin was inadvertent, so even if Tamar was guilty of an illicit relationship, if Yehuda himself had been with a prostitute, how could he judge her? This is not like an average person. This is a leader. This is a leader among his brothers, and also a spiritually intended to be an ancestor of King David and an ancestor of the Davidic dynasty. How could someone on his spiritual level um, make such an accusation when he himself is guilty? Okay. So according to the rabbis, that Yehuda judged her in court, and he brought in another opinion, and that, according to the rabbis, was the opinion of Yitzchak, Isaac. Okay. Now, according to Torah law, in order to impose punishment, there are for this sin, there have to be witnesses who can testify that they warned the defendant not to do whatever this sin is, and that that person said, too bad, I'm going to do it anyway, whatever. If they weren't warned, then the court cannot impose punishment, and the sort of retribution is left in the hands of God. It's left in the hands of heaven. Here, there's no witnesses. There was clearly no warning. There was no defiant reply out of Tamar's mouth. So how do they judge her to be burned? Okay, you hear the question? Here's another question. According to the Midrash, Tamar herself, after she got pregnant, she sort of went around making it known that she was pregnant. She didn't try to hide it. She announced it at the bathhouse, and she said, "Kings will descend from me." And again, her behavior seems like, how do we understand this? Why did she behave in this strange way? And another question is that when she's accused, Tamar could have just told the truth of what happened and saved herself, but she didn't want to publicly embarrass Yehuda. And so from this, there's a very strong lesson that's true for us today, that um, it is it is considered like a I don't want to overstate it. When you embarrass another person publicly, it's a big sin. And it's considered almost like murdering them. Okay. Um, the way that the rabbis say it is that it's better for a person to throw themselves into a fiery furnace than to whiten their friend's face in public. What does that mean, to whiten them in public? You know, when you're embarrassed and all the blood drains from your face? Okay. So first she asked, why does it say to throw oneself into a fiery furnace rather than saying just to be burned? The court didn't kill by throwing people into a furnace. When on, I don't even know if the like a Jewish court ever imposed this, but when it says that somebody was burned, this is a little gross, but what they did was they would pour molten liquid down the throat and they would burn them from the inside out. Now, um, also, she would not have thrown herself into a fiery furnace. If she was being punished in this way, she would have been burned by others. So why don't the rabbis say that it's better for a person to be burned rather than to throw themselves into a fiery furnace than to embarrass somebody publicly? And even more, as we talked about, this rule doesn't even apply to her situation. Why should she give up her life, which would turn Yehuda into a murderer because she did not deserve the death penalty? If Yehuda knew that she wasn't guilty and he let her die anyway, rather than embarrass himself by saying, "Oh, those are my things. I'm the one who was intimate with her and got her pregnant," he would have been guilty of a terrible crime. So why would she allow herself to be killed to save him from being embarrassed? Okay. So these answers are that I'm going to give you are based partially on midrashim of the rabbis and explanations, commentaries and so forth, and partially on some sort of innovative thinking that my teacher did. Do you want to say something, Vicky? Okay. All right. So let's talk about the issue of Tamar posing as a harlot. This is obviously an act of desperation. She had already been married to Er, who died for having done what was evil in the eyes of God. She had already been married to Yehuda, and both of them died. And I'm skipping this because I've already explained this part to you. Um, Tamar knew that she was not responsible for the death of these first two sons. She knew it was their own sin that caused them to die, but she didn't tell this to Yehuda. Now, maybe she thought he wouldn't believe her, or she had pity on Yehuda and his wife, who was alive at the time, and she didn't want to cause them even more pain than they already had because they had at the loss of their two sons. Um, Now, this is right around the time when Yehuda's wife, her name was Bathshua, she died, and that Yehuda suffered all of these painful losses, according to the rabbis. If you go way back to in the beginning, when I was explaining what Yehuda's role was, Yehuda had caused his father Yaakov great pain. It was his idea to sell Yosef, and Yaakov, the father, is in a lot of grief for, I think it's 22 years that they are separated. Okay. So it's a little bit like what we call in Hebrew, mida keneged mida. You caused your father grief over the coming to the conclusion that his son Yosef was dead, and he's grieving for him for 22 years. I think it's 22 years. Now you're going to suffer the loss of people that you love. Okay. So again, Tamar, so maybe as a kindness, she didn't want to say, look, the reason that your sons died is because of this. First of all, it's a little embarrassing and it's very intimate. Um, and also he was already mourning the loss of his two sons. Now he lost his wife. There, there, there are humanitarian reasons why she didn't tell him the truth. Okay. But I said that she knew by prophecy that the kingship of Mashiach was destined to descend from Yehuda, and she wanted to be the mother in that situation. Now, there's a generally speaking, it's forbidden for a father-in-law to marry a daughter-in-law. Okay, but here, where are we in history? The Torah hasn't been given yet, and it wasn't exactly forbidden. So she decides to go about this plan of hers anyway. Now, okay, this is where my teacher's conjecture comes in, that she says, I think that Tamar assumed that after Yehuda realized that she was it was his child that, with whom she was pregnant, he would understand why she had done it and he would decide to marry her. And that would solve the whole problem. That would bring security for Tamar. Um, and Tamar might have feared that Shelah, the third brother, would do what his brothers did and he would also die. But she knew Yehuda wasn't going to commit the sins that her sons had committed because he impregnated her. Okay. So it says that Tamar, this is so fascinating because this is now 3 generations later, I think. Tamar goes to the grave of Abraham to pray that she's able to successfully become the mother of this kingly line. Um, and now it's unclear whether she already came up with this plan and she went to the grave of Abraham to ask for success, right? Or if she, in that prayer time, she was told this is what you ought to do. That part's unclear. But somehow we want, I want you to understand that she's not judged harshly for what she did, even though she played the harlot and slept with her father-in-law, and there was ruse going on. There's like lies. Well, not the outright lies, but there's certainly deception going on here. That she's not considered in any way evil. Now, um, understanding a little bit more about what's going on with Yehuda, that the rabbis say that as he's getting close to where she is, now remember, his wife has just died either 7 days ago or 30 days ago. It's not clear, but relatively recently. Okay. And the Midrash says that God sent an angel of lust to push Yehuda towards Tamar. God wants this union to happen. Okay. And so it's almost like God forces Yehuda's hand. All right. He doesn't, he remember that Yehuda has no idea who is behind these, whatever. He knows it's a woman, but he has no idea it's his daughter-in-law. Um, and so Yehuda, who's now widowed, he's faced with this dilemma. The angel that caused this power of lust to enter his body so strongly that if he tried to ignore it, he would probably have a nocturnal emission. Okay. So which is something he did not want, because that's actually a very great sin in Torah thinking. Um, and he understood the severity of that sin. And there in front of him is this prostitute who's like an answer to this problem. He does, he has this like sexual energy, the sexual tension that's built up in him. Either he can spill his seed, which is a big sin, or he can be with this prostitute. So he's sort of in, and he's a great man. He's sort of stuck in this situation. Now, according to the rabbis, Tamar told him that she wasn't married to somebody else, that she was a convert, whatever that means, that she didn't worship idols, and that she did not currently have her menstrual period, and so she's trying to make the decision easier for him. And so the truth is that before the Torah was given, this wasn't exactly a sin, and according to the laws, the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the laws of Noah, she's permitted to him. She's not an idol worshiper. She's not married to somebody else. She doesn't have her period at the time. Now, Yehuda and his brothers and all of the generations before them, starting from Abraham and Sarah, they tried to keep what the Torah even before it was officially given. But Yehuda calculated that this would be better to sleep with her, which was not technically forbidden at the time, than to cause this um, spilling of seed. Now, I'm gonna, I wasn't gonna, I don't want you can see I'm struggling with this a little bit. I want to say a little bit more about that. And if you don't understand it, that's okay. If you don't accept it, that's okay. I just want to talk about why this issue of spilling seed is such a sin. And it's a little mystical, okay? So this is how I understand this, how my teacher taught it to me. You can take it or leave it as it works for you. But the inside the seed, inside the sperm, there are actually souls. And when the seed is emitted without entering a female, these souls within the seed are then taken over by evil forces and they remain imprisoned until something or someone good, someone doing the right thing, frees them. That's one of the reasons why the matters of in Judaism modesty are so strict, because the idea of a man getting sexually aroused and not having a kosher woman with whom to be intimate so they can do something about it, is a it's such a sin because it's a terrible experience for these souls that are in the semen. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on this because I wasn't even sure if I should tell you about that, but it is a deeper understanding into why it was so why Yehuda made the decision that he made. It wasn't just, oh, my wife's been dead for a week or a month or whatever, and now I just want to be with someone. There was much more driving him to that. And of course, he, on his spiritual level, he understood that. Let's um let's go a little bit more into understanding Tamar. She says to him, well, what will you give me? Right? They're negotiating a price. And he promises that he's going to send two goats from his herd, which are not conveniently with him because he was not planning on having this encounter. And so she says, well, I need some security. I need something from you to make sure that I'm going to get my payment. And what obviously she knows she's not going to be there. She doesn't want his goats. That's not what she's looking for. But she wants to make sure that she has some way to prove that it was Yehuda who was the one who slept with her. Okay. So she's pretty clever. Okay. And of course, after these two unite and they have their moment, then Tamar leaves the scene and she never comes back. And Yehuda sends his friend with the goats. They can't find her. And he asks around, where's the prostitute that sits at this crossroads? And nobody knows anything about her. And they say, I don't know what you're talking about. There was never a prostitute here. Okay. And then Tamar finds out that she's pregnant. And according to the Midrash, she discloses this. I told you this in the bathhouse because on some level, she must have been overjoyed. This is her third partner from this family. And finally, she's pregnant. And not only that, but like her plan works. She's accomplished the spiritual, it's called yibum in Hebrew, but it's creating uh an heir, a spiritual heir. Some people say it's not just an heir, it's actually, if you believe in reincarnation, it's actually the soul of the dead husband is in the body of the child that's created by marrying a relative. But that's going way deeper than we need to. But she's accomplished the idea that from her, kings are going to be descended. Now, why did she disclose all this at the bathhouse? Okay. Everybody knows she's not married. They know what happened to her other husbands. Why does she want to basically publicize, hey, I'm not married and I'm pregnant? Okay. So according to my teacher, she wants this news to get back to Yehuda. Okay. She wants him to put the pieces together and that to understand that Hashem orchestrated this whole thing. Um, for some reason, we don't understand. She didn't just go to Yehuda and say, hey, I'm pregnant and you're the guy who impregnated me. It happened more through hints and, around the back door. Either she thought that when Yehuda would hear that she was pregnant, um, and that she was saying to people, oh, kings are going to be descended from me, he would realize that it was him, because he also knew about himself that he was supposed to be the progenitor, is that the right word, of kings. And and then he would remember, oh, there was this woman, and then she disappeared, and he would put two and two together, and he would realize what happened. Only as obvious as it seems to us, it wasn't God's plan that he should realize it. So one of the underlying themes of this story is God is running this whole thing. He's the one who puts um puts Tamar in this situation where she's acting like she's a prostitute. He's the one who, however you understand this, inflames Yehuda's sexual desire at that exact moment when she's in view. He's the one who orchestrates the fact that um, that she's announcing it, not directly going to talk to him and telling him what happened, but that he's supposed to find out in this way. So here's a lesson in this, that what we understand is entirely in Hashem's hands. And when Hashem doesn't want us to see something, we're not going to see it, as obvious as it might be for some. Do you want to say something? Okay. All right. As obvious as it might be for other people, or in retrospect at that moment, we don't see it. So a great biblical example of this is when the Torah says, much later in the story, in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, when God hardened Paro's heart. Now, anybody could plainly see that him being obstructionist and not letting the I'm glad to hear that. Not letting the Pharaoh see how his behavior is just making things worse and worse and worse for Egypt. It's so obvious, but he can't see it. The same principle exists for us. Okay. That whatever's going on in our lives, there are just times when we cannot see it. So an example might be, let's say that you know somebody who's in a relationship, and to you, it is obvious that this is not a healthy relationship and your friend needs to get out of this relationship, but she can't see it, right? And she goes ahead and marries the guy, and maybe they have a couple of kids before the whole thing breaks down, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now it's so obvious to you. How does she not see it? It's because of this principle that God lets us see what we need to see. Now, maybe there's a reason why she had to go through that in terms of any rectification. Maybe they had a relationship in a previous lifetime. Maybe a certain child needed to be born from this union. I don't know the reason. I'm making this stuff up. Okay. But the principle from that we derive from this story, that when God um, that our again, I'll say it again, our minds are entirely in the hands of Hashem, and when He doesn't want us to see something, we're not going to be able to see it. Okay, so um, instead of so now we're at the point in the story. She's pregnant. She's talking about it. Yehuda finds out, and instead of her coming to him and him saying, "Oh, that's my child. I'm going to marry you," because he's a widower himself, so he doesn't marry her. Instead, he calls her to stand in judgment. Okay, um, and she was she wasn't standing in judgment for harlotry because remember, this is before the Torah is given. It's not yet forbidden. What is he trying her for? A much greater sin of infidelity. Okay, because again, she's supposed to be betrothed to this third son. Now, who is Tamar? Tamar is now the rabbis say she's the daughter of, but my teacher and I were talking about this because this is many, many generations. So there's 10 generations between Adam and Noah, and 10 generations between Noah and Abraham. Okay. And it says that Tamar was the daughter of Shem. Who is Shem? Shem is the son of Noah. Okay. Now, Tamar is, she's involved with Yehuda. So we have Abraham, we have Yitzchak, we have Yaakov, then we have Yehuda. Okay. So that's 4 generations. So it's 14 generations after the time of Noah. So is she 14 or 13 generations removed from her father, or is she like a great, great, great granddaughter? This I don't know, but she comes from the family of Shem, who is the son of Noah. Okay. And so her, let's call him her father because that's how the rabbis talk about it. I don't understand how the timing works out, but her father Shem is also a Kohen. He's a priest. And so, according to the rules, if a woman who's betrothed is commits infidelity, adultery, it's considered adultery, and she incurs the death penalty. And if she's the daughter of a Kohen, if she's the daughter of a priest, then her death by burning is this molten hot liquid is poured down her throat, which is kind of gross. But again, we go back to the question, how could the court decide to burn her when there were no witnesses, no warning, and she never said, I don't care what you say, I'm doing it anyway, all of which are conditions that are necessary in Jewish law, in Torah law, to convict somebody. And how could she be held accountable for a Torah law before the law was even given? The Torah hasn't been given yet, right? You hear all these questions are just mounting up, okay? And so one of the conclusions my teacher comes to is that Yehuda's not actually saying to burn Tamar. He's saying that this is going to happen on its own. So here's what it says in the verse. I'm sorry I didn't look up the exact place, but it says that what Yehuda said is take her out and she will be burned. Now there's something strange here about the sentence structure because the beginning of the sentence, take her out, is active. It's a command. And the end of the sentence, she will be burned, is passive. He never orders anybody to burn her, but that just that it's going to happen because he can't actually punish her for all kinds of reasons. It's true that on the face of it, Tamar had committed a terrible sin by supposedly committing adultery, and the sin was made much worse by the fact that she was a daughter of this holy man. And also, she was kind of brazen, going around happily telling everybody, "Yeah, I know I'm like a twice over widow and I'm supposed to be engaged to this other guy, but look, I'm pregnant," rather than being keeping quiet about it. Okay, so it looks like she's trying to publicly what do we call it? Like when a teenager does something like this, when they it's like they're trying to embarrass their parents. Okay. So in Yehuda's eyes, it's clear to him that she deserves this punishment. She deserves to die for causing such a desecration of God's name. But again, no witnesses, no warning, no defiant answer. So he can't actually actively punish her, but he's suggesting that she's going to die at the hands of heaven because there is this sort of general principle that if somebody is guilty of the death penalty and for whatever reason the court can't enforce the death penalty, then heaven takes care of it. Okay. So, um, according to the theory of my teacher, then Tamar knew she wasn't guilty. She also knew she wasn't going to die by the hand of heaven. She wasn't guilty of harlotry and she wasn't guilty of adultery. But now she has a whole new problem because if nothing happens to her, that's really going to create a desecration of God's name. It's going to look like she misbehaved to everybody else, that she misbehaved. All of these people, by the way, this is not like some quiet family that lives off by themselves and nobody knows them. This is a very prominent family, and it's going to cause people to say, you see this? That means there really is no such thing as death at the hands of heaven. There's no heavenly punishment. God is not running the world, right? Because it's going to look like she got away with it. So now she's got this terrible dilemma. She doesn't want to create this desecration of God's name. And so she has two choices. She can either tell everybody what really happened, which is going to cause great public embarrassment to Yehuda, because no one knew that this angel of lust had overcome him and forced him into it. They would just think that this great man, the son of Yaakov, and the leader of his brothers had consorted with this woman that he thought was a prostitute, and he would be incredibly embarrassed. The other possibility that Tamar has facing her would be to actually pretend that to throw herself into a fiery furnace and proving to the world that there really is heavenly punishment. And she was prepared to do that, actually, rather than to publicly embarrass Yehuda. Um, because she feels like it's because she went to the grave of Abraham, the grave of Abraham, to pray for success, that she sort of entrapped him. He would never have turned to a harlot if it hadn't been for the strength of her prayers. This is what she's thinking to herself. But that's a terrible dilemma. Like whatever, either choice is terrible. And so there's another midrash that says privately Tamar planned to send to Yehuda. Um, I want to take your question, but I just want to finish this, okay? Um, the things that he had left with her, the staff, the strings, the coat, I forget the three things, but the satan, the evil one who was fighting her all of this way, he made them all disappear. She couldn't find them to send them to Yehuda. Um, and so she prays and prays to try to find them, but she decides if they're not going to be found, no matter what, she's not going to publicly shame Yehuda. And then if she finds them, um, which she did find them, and she sends them to Yehuda. And then Tamar's thinking is, well, if he admits, that's good. And if not, it's better for me to throw myself into a fiery furnace than to embarrass him publicly. Um, However, Yehuda, he does admit it. He admits that she's been right. Um, he was wrong in withholding his third son, and he understood that she had to resort to pretending to be a prostitute to bring about this union between her and his family. And okay, there's what Yehuda says is tzadika mimeni, which literally means she is more righteous than me. Um, and in other words, Hashem is saying neither of them is being held responsible for what happened. There's no desecration of God's name because God orchestrated this whole encounter. Now, when Yehuda admitted, yes, she's more righteous than me, and I am the father of this. Well, he doesn't know it's twins yet, but the father of this pregnancy. That he said to himself, "It's better for me to die of embarrassment in this world than in the world to come." And that was an awesome test for him. By standing up to the test, he actually rectified part of the sin of Adam. Why? When God confronts Adam with his sin, what does Adam do? He blames it on the woman who talked him into doing it. And that was all wrong. Instead of blaming someone else, even though she had truly pressured him, but he should have admitted his sin and humbly asked God for forgiveness. Because Adam did not do that, he was expelled from Gan Eden, from the Garden of Eden. He lost his great stature. He brought the whole world into a state of exile, which is only going to be rectified through Mashiach ben David. Yehuda did exactly the opposite. Even though he found admitting it obviously embarrassing, Yehuda, who was well known for being righteous, passed the test. Furthermore, he could have easily blamed the whole thing on Tamar. She fooled him. She deliberately lured him. It was the woman's fault, right? He could have said that, but he didn't. Despite his fear and his embarrassment, he saw that she was clearly right because he had withheld his third son and she had to resort to this. And so, for his courage and honesty in admitting the truth on all counts, Yehuda became worthy of kingship, worthy of marrying Tamar, who was a great woman in her own right, and worthy of becoming the ancestor of um, the Melech HaMashiach, the Messiah King, who will rectify the world ultimately from the sin of Adam. Okay, I just want to finish with this one last thing, and then Vicky, if you have a question, I'm happy to take it. There are a few seemingly illicit relationships on the way to Mashiach, and there's spiritual reasons why that is the case. And I just want to review them. You know these stories, but so Tamar and Yehuda, this story that we've just spent an hour on, they conceive Peretz. Okay. Peretz is whatever I said, the great, great, great grandfather of Boaz. Okay. So Boaz is a descendant of Peretz. Ruth, here's the other line. Ruth comes from Moab. Where does Moab come from? The original Moab, we talked about this whenever we did that Parsha, was the son of Lot and one of his daughters. So both Boaz and Ruth come from somewhat questionable, whatever, like this relationships that were not necessarily seemingly so kosher, but they come together and they conceive Oved, who conceives Yishai, who conceives Dave. Obviously, there's women involved in this process. But the other thing, and the last thing I want to leave you with, it goes back to last week, that there's another thing I learned from my teacher, is that Dinah and Shem right? So Shem rapes Dinah. She gets pregnant. She conceives Osnat. Osnat marries Yosef. Okay. And they have these two children, Ephraim and Manasseh. I think I'm sure we talked about this last year, is that there's Mashiach ben David and there's also Mashiach ben Yosef. So Mashiach ben Yosef Yosef is an ancestor of Mashiach ben Yosef. So Yosef's wife is also who was conceived from this rape between the Canaanite Shem and the Israelite Dinah. Are you with me here? So even that line is like um, coming through relationships that are not like two people fall in love and they get married and have children. So that there's this idea that the the line that leads to Mashiach is so full of spiritual light that God hides it in these seemingly illicit relationships. But what I said all along, which is as true in our lives as it is in the story of Yehuda and Tamar, but that God is orchestrating the whole thing. It's going somewhere. And there's a reason why he put these two people together. Okay, so that is the lesson for this week's parsha. And now we have just a few minutes left, and I just want to see. Um, okay, all right, Vicky, do you want to ask a question? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, thank you so much. So I had the question that I have is, are in Judaism, is it okay to pray to your ancestors? Is that what Tamara was doing in the cave, or was she praying directly to Hashem in that cave? Does that make
Such a
sense?
great question. And it's a question that's
It's
it's relevant now because it is common for people to go to the graves of great people who are dead. It's very common to do it in Israel, but people also do it in the Ukraine, where there's a number of important rabbis who are buried there. So this is our understanding, is that we only pray to God. However, the person at whose grave you stand has certain spiritual merits. And if it's somebody like Abraham or some great ancestor, they sort of gave, at least the Jewish people, I don't know beyond that, I'm sorry that I don't, but they gave us the ability to use some of their merit to get their prayers noticed. So we don't pray to Abraham. We don't pray to Rebbe Nachman. We don't pray to anybody's grave that you might go to, but you are in a holy place. You are in a place, and you can, in the name of that person, you can ask that person to intercede on your behalf with God. And your question is such a great question because it's totally relevant now, because there are some people who think that they're actually praying to the dead rabbi or to the dead biblical character. And that is um, heresy because we only ever pray to God. Okay. Anybody else have anything, comments, questions before we finish? No? Can you just have, was there anything here that you did not hear before? Okay, great. That's my goal. Okay. Thank you
Yeah,
for joining. Yeah,
I
go
could
ahead.
add that this has been incredible because it connects all the dots. A lot of times in my mindset and in the way that I've been taught, oh, God doesn't orchestrate anything bad. He just Hashem just does everything that's good. And ultimately it's about his will and the grace that he has throughout time and everything will work out the way that it's been prophesied according to his plan, and it's beautiful to see that mindset. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And I just want to add to that, Margaret, I see you want to say something, is that it's not only it's that we are not able to judge what's good and bad.
Mhm.
It what seems bad, like okay, Yehuda's in this tight situation, Tamar's in this tight situation. This does not look, it's not comfortable, it doesn't look good. Everybody's it's embarrassing, it's a whole big mess. And yet we know that from that comes Mashiach.
Hmm.
So the idea or the humbling lesson in this is that we are um, just small players. We don't have the whole script and that God is running the show. And even when something seems because it's bad in the short term, that doesn't mean that it's bad in the long term. That's what I
Hmm.
believe that nothing is and all of us have probably lived long enough
Hmm.
that something that was happening at the time that seemed very painful to us, we understand we were God was able to reveal to us how that actually was for the good
Hmm.
ultimately. But there's so much more that we just don't know yet.
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
what my husband calls the great lecture at the end of time, when Mashiach's going to come and explain everything, how all the pieces fit together and why this happened and why that had to happen and all that. And it is that's like that's comes from a place of faith, right? That right now our job is just to hold on to the rope that's shaking and trust that God will explain it all. Margaret, before we go, you want to finish us
No,
off?
I just wanted to, you kind of summed it up really great because this is really just increases your faith. Because even when you think things should go a certain way, if it doesn't, God has many ways to get his plans accomplished. But so many times in our own mind, we only see the one way and we just figure you fight against the war within your own soul as to how's this going to come about because this has just destroyed everything, and that's never true with God. So as you were talking about the story, it goes back to what Victoria said. It connects all the dots.
That's beautiful. Yes, thank you. You guys are great students. Wait, Martina, you want to say something?
Yes, what you just said about, that's often for our good, what we think it's bad. I actually just read the book, Why Bad Things Don't Happen to Good People from Rabbi Shul Rosenblatt. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It talks about this. And
There's a okay. There's a book called Why Bad Things Happen to Good
happen to
People.
good people, yeah. And then the don't is on the side.
Okay, good. Because the
It's
book Why Bad Things Happen to Good People is
mm-hmm.
I would put it in the class of heresy.
Okay.
He but it sounds like this is an answer to that. Why bad things? What is the title? Why bad things?
It says why bad things happen to good people, but it says actually don't on the side. So I'm thinking it's why bad things don't happen to good people. And it's from Rabbi Shul Rosenblatt.
Rosenblatt. Okay, I'm going to look
Yeah.
for it
Yeah, look
because
for it and
I think
see.
it's probably an answer to the one that a lot of people think is heretical. Because basically, what I don't even want to tell you what he says, but it's not consistent with Torah thinking.
Okay.
So yeah, all right, I'll
Yeah.
look up that
Could
one
you
because
check
I
this out then? That would be great if you would do
sure
that.
I'll let you know if it's like
Okay.
kosher. Okay,
Yes, that's right.
Vicky, do you want to say one more thing? Okay, all right. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great week. Bye.